So, as we get started this morning, I have to come clean. I made a huge mistake last week. Before I could say anything, I have to set this straight because I referenced last week the Pixar movie Inside Out. But rather than call it Inside Out, Alex pointed out that I accidentally called it In and Out. And maybe I was hungry and I was thinking about lunch, but I apologize to every Inside Out fan in here. Thanks for letting me get off my chest. I feel a lot better about myself now. But actually, when I think about last week's message and what I shared with you, I do actually feel like I missed something else that was important. Last week we covered chapters 6 and 7 of Joshua. So chapter 6 is Israel's victory at Jericho, and chapter 7 is Israel's defeat at Ai. Chapter 6, Rahab and her Canaanite family are saved, while Achan and his Israelite family were destroyed in chapter 7. And while these two chapters clearly go together, preaching chapters 6 and 7 without chapter 8 is kind of like watching Star Wars episode 4 and 5 without watching episode 6. Right? Stay with me. Episode 4 is this great victorious movie where the underdog rebels blow up the Death Star of the evil empire. But then you have episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, which is arguably the best of all of the movies, but it's a total downer, right? Luke loses his hand. Spoiler, it's been out for decades. You should know that by now. Han is cryogenically frozen. The rebel base is destroyed, and all New Hope from episode 4 is lost. You need episode 6, Return of the Jedi, to see and hear the full story. Joshua chapter 8 finishes the story that's being told in chapter 6 and 7. And so if I had to do it all over again, I would have included chapter 8 in last week's sermon. And maybe you're thinking, why does this matter? Why is this a big deal? It matters because by focusing only on chapter 6 and 7, last week's message had the potential to leave you thinking, there are only two options in life and faith: victory and defeat. But the story that scriptures tell us is so much more complex than that. Heard together as a sort of epic trilogy, right? Chapter 6 and 7 show us that victory can actually be undermined by defeat. And then when heard together, chapter 7 and 8 can show us how defeat can be overcome by God's victory. And so you have chapter 6 and you have chapters 8 that give us these two paths to victory. The first is victory by God's hand. The second is actually also victory by God's hand, but it's victory that has to overcome the efforts of God's own people who seem to be working hard to thwart that victory. And so right in the middle of God's victories, chapter 7 shows us how God's own people can position themselves as enemies of God and enemies of God's plans. For us, thinking back to the time that we spent last year in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, we can start to think of examples pretty quickly where Jesus' followers stood in the way of what Jesus was doing. Like when Peter told Jesus that he should not suffer and die, and Jesus says to him, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter had positioned himself as an enemy of God and God's plan. Or when James and John asked Jesus if he would call down fire to destroy a Samaritan village. Or when parents were bringing their children to come and to be blessed by Jesus, and the disciples barked at them to stay away. It's important for us who seek Jesus to recognize how easy it is for us who know Jesus and who follow Jesus, how easy it is for us to oppose God, setting ourselves against him and against his plans. Joshua 6, 7, and 8 help us see this potential in ourselves, which sets the stage for this morning's passage. Chapters 9 through 12 give us a deep and thorough look at the enemies of God. Think about the genius of this storytelling. God is preparing to instruct us on what it looks like when God defeats his enemies. But before getting into the enemies that are out there, God focuses on the enemies in here. Because how quickly do we look at others and go, yep, they're terrible, and they deserve whatever happens to them, rather than look at ourselves and say, what do I need to allow God to change in me? By introducing chapters 9 through 12 in this way, all of God's people throughout all of time since this text was available to God's people have been given a warning. Don't forget that just because God chose you doesn't mean that you have the freedom to do whatever you want. Don't forget that God has chosen you to be a part of his mission, which means that he calls the shots. And so you don't get to do whatever it takes or whatever you want to accomplish his mission. And don't forget that in fighting with God against his enemies, we have to be careful that we do not become like God's enemies in the process. And so with this warning firmly in our minds, we move forward. Joshua chapters 9 through 12 introduce us to three key questions that run through the entire Bible. In fact, the answers that Joshua gives to these questions are actually the same answers that the New Testament will give us, and we'll keep using to explain who Jesus is and what Jesus has done and what he continues to do. And so the questions that Joshua answers are, who are God's enemies? What makes them God's enemies? And what happens to God's enemies? We're going to see how Joshua answers these three questions kind of as we look at these passages together. Who are God's enemies? What makes them God's enemies? And what happens to God's enemies? This is really one of those passages that has to be sort of seen or heard for effect. Here's what I mean by that. I was working on this message, and I had my small group study out, and it was open to the text that was the text that we give out with the small group that doesn't have chapter headings or chapter titles or section headings. And it was what I had used for my first read through. And so it was just marked up entirely with colored pencils. And Rebecca, my oldest daughter, was standing right next to me looking at the page, and she asked me, why'd you put boxes around king so many times? King, 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 king. And I said, because Joshua is obsessed with kings. And so turn to chapter 10. We will look at Joshua's obsession with kings. Starting in verse 1. As soon as Adonai-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard that what Joshua did to the king of Ai, and as he had done to the king of Jericho, he feared greatly. Jump to verse 3. So the king of Jerusalem sent to the king of Hebron, king of Jarmuth, king of Lachish, king of Eglon, saying, come up to help me. Verse 5. Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered their forces and went up with all of their armies. You can hear it, right? Or if you've marked it on your page, it just jumps out at you. King, 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 king. And it rings through this passage. These 5 kings hear what God has done through Joshua and his people, and so they join forces together to come against Israel, against Israel's allies, and against Israel's God. But these kings and their armies are pretty quickly defeated. Look at verse 16. These 5 kings fled, and they hid in the cave of Makeda. Joshua comes along and he covers the mouth of this cave with a giant stone in order to keep the kings there until he's done and he's ready to deal with them. But we pick back up in verse 22. And then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me from the cave." And they did so, and brought those 5 kings out to him from the cave: the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And when they brought those kings out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all of the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with them, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." And so they came near and put their feet on the necks of the kings. So thinking about our 3 questions for the morning, if we were going to stop right here, these 5 kings are the enemies of God. And we're not really told anything about why they are God's enemies, except that they come and attack Israel's allies after hearing what Joshua has done to the kings of Jericho and Ai. And the 5 kings are then put to death. This is what happens to them. So, interesting. Let's keep these 5 kings in mind then as we move on. Verse 28. We keep reading. "And he, Joshua, did to the king of Makeda, just as he had done to the king of Jericho." Verse 30. "And the Lord gave it, the city of Libnah, also and its king into the hand of Israel, and he did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho." Then verse 33. "Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua struck him and his people until he left nothing." So the king of Makeda, the king of Libnah, the king of Gezer. Kings are sort of piling up. And we get to verse 40. "So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country, the Negeb, and the lowland and the slopes." These are basically geographical markers of the southern region of Israel. "And all their kings. He left nothing remaining." But this summary only includes the southern regions of the land. Chapter 11 then describes the same thing as God leads Joshua and Israel up into the northern part of the land. We get the northern summary starting in chapter 11, verse 12. "And all the cities of those kings and all their kings Joshua captured and struck them with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded." And then we get a final summary that includes both north and south in verse 16. So start in verse 16, chapter 11, verse 16. "So Joshua took all of that land," and we're given a sort of geographical tour of all of that land, and picks back up in verse 17. "And he captured all their kings and struck them and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all of those kings. There was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel, except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction, and should receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses." So, once again, the 3 questions. Who are God's enemies? Well, the answer would seem to be any king and the people who follow that king. What makes these kings and their people God's enemies? Well, this final summary gives us the closest thing we have to a clear answer. And there seem to be 2 parts to the king's opposition to God. First, the Lord has hardened the hearts of these kings in some way. And the second is that this heart hardening has resulted in the kings coming against Israel in battle. You may not be entirely comfortable with this answer, but we'll talk more about what this might mean in just kind of a few minutes. But the third question, what happens to God's enemies? Well, the same as in our first example. Simply put, they are destroyed. To which we go, oh, okay, what do we do with this? just to make the point that much more clear that this is what this passage is about. The framing verses of this entire passage, chapters 9 and 12, say exactly this. So if you look at the beginning of chapter 9, you read verse 1, as soon as all of the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. This phrase, as one, they joined together as one, is the same word that's used to speak of a husband and a wife coming together as one. The idea being unity with distinct parts. The kings, independent of one another, have joined together in a union against God. And so then you turn to chapter 12, the very end of our passage, verse 7. And we hear, and these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the people of Israel defeated on the west side of the Jordan. And then one by one, they're named. In verse 9, we read the king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. The king of Jerusalem, 1. 1 being listed after each of the kings, 1 being the same word that was used in chapter 9 to describe the kings of the land joining together as one. And on until 31 kings have been identified as this one single unified force opposing God. So who are God's enemies? All kings, apparently. Why are they God's enemies? Because they have united against God and God's plans. What happens to God's enemies? In Joshua, they are defeated. I mean, this is in some ways pretty straightforward. But it's actually really interesting, and I struggled to identify this in this passage. I had read and I had reread the passage in some of my early preparation to work through Joshua together with you. I actually even wrote out a summary of what I thought was going on in this larger section, but I was sort of unaware of the central themes, and I actually thought that chapter 8 fit better with some of what was going on here, and I didn't actually notice the king theme that when you read it, you go, oh yeah, that's really obvious, until Tom Bashada, who's out of town this weekend, he's been writing our daily worship guides for Joshua. And he and I were just chatting, and he was bouncing some observations he'd been making as he'd been reading and studying and preparing to write these things. And he just said, kind of in passing, I noticed the Gibeonites are the only people who do not have a king in this whole section. And he went on and was just talking about some different things. And he pointed out a couple different places where there's all this language about kings, only to then say, and then the Gibeonites, who, and they as a people, something along those lines. And as we were talking, it just kind of struck me. And I couldn't get away from the idea. And so he left, and I spent an unreasonable amount of time that day studying these chapters, reading them over and over, because as we read earlier in chapter 11, verse 19, chapter 11, verse 19, we read, there was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the inhabitants of Gibeon. And here Tom was highlighting what might make Gibeon unique. And we read in chapter 9 that while the kings of the land heard what God was doing and responded with violence, chapter 9 verse 3 tells us that it was the inhabitants of Gibeon who heard what God was doing and they acted with cunning. And were immediately struck by a possibility. Kings who feel threatened have only one possible action, right? Listen to some of our presidential candidates right now. When we feel threatened, when we feel unsafe, what should we do? We rise up. We flex our muscles. We fight back. We show who is the strongest. We defend ourselves. This is what we hear, right? But when a community led by elders is threatened by the exact same danger that all of these people with kings are facing, they don't instinctively fight back. They don't instinctively rise up. They use their brains. It turns out they're clever. They come up with a creative alternative. Turn with me to the beginning of chapter 10. You have to hear this. Chapter 10, verse 1. As soon as Adonizedek heard how Joshua had captured Ai. Remember, Adonizedek is the king of Jerusalem. He's the one who initiates this whole movement. As soon as he heard that they had captured Ai and devoted it to destruction, doing to Ai and its kings as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, he feared greatly. Listen to how Gibeon is described. The king of Jerusalem feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, the city that had just been destroyed, and all of its men were warriors. Did you catch that? Right? It's not as though Gibeon doesn't have the strength to fight. In fact, it's just the opposite. Gibeon was a city bigger than Ai, with more warriors. And as a city, it was as great as any of the royal cities, the cities with kings in them, meaning it was big and it was likely wealthy and it was likely heavily fortified. It was as great as any city with any king in the land. And on top of that, Israel had just lost a battle to Ai. Ai, who the Gibeonites are bigger than. Gibeon had every reason to sort of arrogantly believe that they could stand against the Israelites. The evidence was in their favor. But the wisdom of elders is more cunning than the pride of kings. The pride of kings only ever has one answer in this world: bigger and better swords. Kings are so boringly predictable. The wisdom of elders comes with the built-in creativity of entire communities. Tom was exactly right. There is not a single mention of a king related to Gibeon at any point in this entire passage, and they are the only people who survive. On the flip side, every single city or people who were destroyed are described as having a king. No people group is described as having been destroyed apart from their having had a king who rose up against God and against God's plans. So what does this mean? Well, Jesus said that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. That is certainly true of every king in the land. I don't know how you would translate that to the Gibeonites. Those who live by their brains. I don't know. We can work on that one. But as we consider how this then is significant for us, it's important for us that we expand the meaning of king a bit. And I think that there's some freedom to do that in light of this text, right? Because we tend to think of kings as emperors. The king of the British Empire that spanned the entire world, right? That the sun did not set on. Tyrannical rulers who rule over huge plots of land. But these kings are not kings like any of those kings. These kings in Joshua are rulers over cities. They're more like mayors, minus city councils and plus many armies, but pretty much the same thing, right? But really, a king is someone who, relative to the people around them, has some sort of unrivaled position of power. And so it could be a president. It could be a prime minister. It could be a father or a mother in a household. The important thing is the position and the power over others that position holds. A king usually becomes a king through fighting, through taking a city, or by having it handed down to them by a parent. Even in an election, There is the idea that the ruler has been given special power, a special mandate to rule. We're talking about power. Either way, kings tend to believe that they deserve what they have, tend to believe that they have built their kingdom and that it belongs to them, tend to see themselves as deserving it. Kings will do anything to protect what belongs to them. This is why when God brings people against the kings of Canaan, the kings aren't having it. Their hearts are hardened and they join together and they fight against God. They believe their cities belong to them. They believe that they ought to be able to rule however they want. They believe that they have the right to it. But in the first 5 books of the Bible leading up to Joshua, God has been making the case that the kings of Canaan have done nothing but pollute the land that they supposedly rule over with violence. They kill their babies and their children as offerings to their gods. They kill their neighbors unjustly. They kill anyone who stands in their way of acquiring more wealth or women or weapons, whatever it is that they have their eyes on to acquire. The kings of Canaan must be stopped. But Joshua really is just laying the groundwork for a much more universal truth. God is against all kings. I don't know how you feel about that statement, especially having connected the kings of Joshua to presidents and rulers that we may be familiar with. But I want to suggest this and offer it to you as we read through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings together this year. Listen as we make our way through these texts. You'll hear that God is against kings in all of their forms. The only reason God gives Israel a king is because they desperately beg him. And so he gives them over to the desires of their heart. Kings are a concession that God makes to show his people firsthand just how terrible human kings can be. This is ultimately the story of David. That even the very best man, a man with a soft heart and a true desire to honor God, right? The scriptures tell us that David is a man after God's own heart, that even a man like this cannot serve as king without being corrupted by the position. Right? David is not allowed to build the temple for God because, Chronicles tells us, he was too violent. He had too much blood on his hands because kings fight. Kings go to war. And this disqualified him. But more than that, David's family would suffer for generations. The people of Israel would suffer for generations because David, as a man after God's own heart, began to enjoy the comforts of being king, so much so that he was unable to resist the power that he had been given to take a man's wife as though she belonged to him. This is what kings do. In the New Testament, it is the rulers of Israel, it is the rulers of Rome who have something to lose. And so they feel threatened by Jesus. And so they rise up against him and they kill him. In the story of Jesus, we see the pattern of Joshua happening again. The people see what God is doing in Jesus and they feel threatened. And so they rise up against him. And we're immediately struck by Jesus, right? Because in Joshua, the answer to the question, what happens to God's enemies, is they are killed. But when God puts flesh on, when God dwells among us, when he lets himself be destroyed, he lets himself be killed by the violence of wicked rulers, God suffers and dies for his enemies. It shouldn't surprise us that Peter stands in front of Jesus and says, no, you shouldn't do that. Peter rightly believed that Jesus was the true king. Kings don't die. The Bible is an intensely political book. Politics is nothing more than power. How is power distributed among people? Who has power? Who gets power? How is that power kept, and what happens when somebody has power? This is all politics really is. Kings always believe they have power. But God is calling the kings of the earth to lay down their crowns, to lay down their weapons, to lay down their kingdoms, and to become members of the only true and lasting kingdom, God's kingdom. This is the story that echoes through Scripture. And this is also why, especially as we think about kings in a bit broader of a sense, this is why Jesus says things like, it's impossible for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. It's not because they have money. It's that we tend to believe when we have money that we somehow deserved it, that we somehow earned it. And if anybody threatens to come and try to take it, we immediately reveal that we believe that we are kings of our own households. What do we do with the things that we hold in our possessions? Do we, like the Gibeonites, offer our entire lives and even our kingdom and our royal city into the service of the one true king? Or do we cling to everything we have as though it is our job to protect it and to preserve it, to keep it for ourselves? Who are the enemies of God? Those who stand against God as though they were kings. Those who hear the call of God's kingdom and go, no, I like my kingdom better. Those who rise up and resist God and his reign. What makes them enemies of God? The scripture says it's the hardness of our hearts. We do not trust that God knows best. That we don't trust that God knows the best way to live. We do not trust that God will care for our needs. That we do not trust that God is able and willing ultimately to raise the dead. And so what happens to God's enemies? This is the question, right? Well, they're invited to this table. Paul tells us that while we were still enemies of God, Christ died for us. That to demonstrate that the most powerful weapon that we think we have, which is to inflict death on another person, that in the face of a God who raises the dead, what power do we have? Jesus endures our violence, our violent hearts. He endures the rage that we have when we hear the demands of his kingdom. And he says, do your best to me. When we come to the table, when Jesus says, I offer my life, my body, and my blood for you, what he's saying is, I've come to show you a better way. I've come to show you the way of life, which means stop resisting. Stop thinking that you can be a better king, a better God over your own life, over your own kingdom. But submit your life and your ways. Submit everything you have to the God of the universe, the one who gives life, the one who will take your very worst violence, very worst weapons, and overcome them, because he can. This morning, as we come to the table, we do so thinking about, what does it mean to declare the good news? In the New Testament, the good news simply said, Jesus is Lord. This is how Paul summarizes it. This is in Acts, what we hear the disciples saying, Jesus is Lord. All right? And sometimes we've heard that so many times that we go, yeah, Jesus is Lord. He's my Lord and Savior. I totally get that. But Lord is what the emperor was called. Lord is what you called those who had great power over you. Jesus is Lord means Jesus is King. Jesus is the one true King who shows us how to wield that power, and what does the King of the universe do for us but offer his life in our place so that we could be forgiven of the hardness of our hearts, so that the Spirit of God could come and do its work in us, softening our hearts, so that we could respond to God anew in this day. This is the good news. And so as we come, as we receive the bread, as we receive the cup this morning, what does it mean this morning to declare that Jesus is Lord, that God is King, and that we are not? This is something we will confess today, and that we'll leave here and go, I need to confess that again. And then later tonight, we'll go, ooh, I need to confess that again. And then tomorrow morning, right, there's this reality that every day we're learning more and more to give our lives over to God and to his reign and to his direction. And so one of the joys that we get as a community is to be cunning together. It would be easy for me as pastor to seize this as a position of power, right? And to tell you, this is how you should obey Jesus. But I don't think that's what a pastor is when I read the New Testament. I think that I am one of a number of overseers of this congregation. One of my jobs among us is to open the word with us, but one of the things we get to do, like the Gibeonites together, is say, what does it look like as we see God and God's reign coming at us? How do we respond to that? Which means, how do we live, right? How do we order our lives in such a way that together we come into sync with who God is and what God is doing? I want to suggest that is a question that can only be answered as we talk about it in community. That is why our small groups are so essential to our life together. That's why the daily worship guide is part of our everyday routines, have us talking about how do we live with Jesus, submitting our lives every day, allowing him to soften our hearts so that we don't rise up against him as his enemies. So, if this morning you find yourself as one of his enemies, know that Christ died for you, so that today you don't have to continue as one of his enemies. If today you know yourself as a son or a daughter of the Most High God, come to the table celebrating the incredible work that God has done in your life to change you and to make you an ambassador in his kingdom.